It's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider. So today of all days, we're going to explore what the election results mean for public education. We're going to hear from Jennifer Berkshire, who's an education historian, and from Jack Schneider. They are both authors of The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual. We're going to hear from them about what's next for public schools in Massachusetts and beyond. Jennifer's a freelance journalist, and she's the co-host of the education podcast, Have You Heard? Along with Jack. Jack Schneider is the Dwight W. Allen Distinguished Professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he leads the Beyond Test Scores project. They previously co-authored also a wonderful book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of Schools. Please welcome Jennifer and Jack.
Well, thank you so much for having us, like a lot of people, on the call and off. I have been having a little bit of a day. I was up very late and, now suddenly the world looks a little different than it did yesterday. But I have to tell you that I can't think of a better way to spend to begin my process of preparing for the kind of organizing that we're going to need to do than by getting together with all of you. I already saw somebody sharing that solidarity is the path forward, and I have to say that I think that is objectively true.
Yeah, I have been, like many people, trying to sort through feelings today, and I was running professional development for educators in Springfield yesterday, and the PD was around civic mindsets and civic dispositions and how to cultivate those among students. And so that primed me today for thinking about what is the civic mindset or disposition that would be useful to me today and that might make me useful to my fellow residents of the Commonwealth and fellow Americans. And I think civic courage in place of pathos is how I'm trying to frame my own mindset. And I think that in our conversation today, Jennifer and I will be framing out some very real threats that public education faces. We have had the luxury of not having had a disruptive and interventionist federal government seeking to do in Massachusetts what disruptive and interventionist state departments of education have been doing basically in every state with a conservative majority in the legislature. And Massachusetts will now be like many states, I anticipate, in facing some of these challenges because they're going to rise up above the state level to the federal level. And so I think we're going to need lots of civic courage as we begin to act as leaders and as good community members together. And so I'm excited to be here with all of you. It's as per usual, I'm echoing the same sentiment as Jennifer, but taking approximately 3 times as many words to say it.
I didn't want to say anything. So I actually want to start by sharing with you all a little story that I think sets the stage for where we are today. I live up in Gloucester, which is definitely one of the more purple parts of Massachusetts. Gloucester can often feel a lot like New Hampshire. And I have to say that over the past couple of weeks, you could feel something in the air here. That maybe all of the stories that I was so busy clicking on about the joyful campaign that was going to win the day, there was a disconnect between that and what I was seeing on the ground. And then last week, students at Gloucester High School participated in their mock election. They voted on president and senator and all the ballot questions, and they went for Donald Trump. And to me, that was very eye-opening because one of the things that Jack and I argue in our book, The Education Wars, is that a lot of the intense back and forth we're seeing right now is about a generational split, that young people are more progressive than the generations that came before them. But when I looked at that result, I realized that in fact I had been missing something about my own community. I'm not from Gloucester, but it is now my adopted hometown. Because what that tells me is that those kids didn't fall out of a coconut tree, right? Like they're coming into school hearing from their parents that this is the candidate they're excited about. Now, what I also want you to know about Gloucester is that if you drive around town, the most common sign you will see right now is not one that says Trump or Vance or Harris or Walz. It's one that says fully fund Gloucester schools. It's one that says we support Gloucester educators. And sometimes it's one that says we demand a living wage for our paraprofessionals. And when I tell you that you see these signs in front of all kinds of houses, I am not exaggerating. Down the street from me, there is a fully fund our school sign out in front of a house that is bedecked with two different Trump flags, including the old school Let's Go Brandon flag. If you drive the other direction, you'll see fully fund our schools in front of a house that's draped with one of the expanded LGBTQ flags with all of the additional colors, like the full rainbow. And so to me, when I consider what it means that at a time that we're so divided, that this community that turns out to actually be very typical if we look at the results last night, agrees that they want fully funded schools, that they share a vision for a robust public education. And one last point, the students voted yes on every ballot question, which to me indicates that they, whoever they endorsed for president, they have an economically progressive view of the future. And you will be happy to know that they voted to end the use of MCAS as their graduation requirement by a margin of something like 9-1. So I just wanted to put that out there to sort of set the stage. And Jack, I thought that before we get into the gloom and doom portion of our talk, which full spoiler, that will take some time, let's just talk about some of the positive signs that we saw, starting with the resounding victory for Yes on 2 that you all were involved in. And Jack, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that is worth paying attention to that is in line with what Jennifer was just discussing is a bigger national trend. So yes, question 2 is in line with this, but of course we also know that Massachusetts went overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. But I think it's maybe less obvious that places like Kentucky both stood up for public education by rejecting a private school voucher bill and voted for the Trump-Vance ticket. And so if we're thinking about specifically what we as activists and allies can do to support public education, I think one piece of good news out there is that even though the Republican Party has made it a part of its platform to engage in an all-out assault on public education, that there is no taste for that nationwide. And we're mostly going to talk about education and specifically public education today. But I think there's also some hope for thinking about the ways that support for our public schools can be used to build broader coalitions that bring in people who have felt politically disaffected and therefore possibly inclined to vote for somebody like Donald Trump. And there may be people on this call who did not vote for Kamala Harris and who have never voted for a Democrat. And so I don't presume to suggest that all of us need to get in line with a particular party, but I do think that it's essential for all of us to recognize certain kinds of democratic norms and that public education can be a useful mechanism for us to begin to reestablish what it means to act as a member of a democratic community, and the kind of give and take that that requires, which we have not seen from the president-elect. And so, part of the good news here is that this is not necessarily going to be the most difficult uphill swim if we're starting with the schools and starting with a defense of public education, and then beginning to use broad-based support for public education as a way of making the case for democratic practices, for supporting longstanding institutions that are at the heart of democratic communities, and for fostering the kind of debate and dialogue that has actually been pretty roundly rejected by the president-elect.
And Jack, you timed your remarks to end just as the commuter rail was trundling by my house. So I would just add a little bit more context to what you just heard from Jack. There were actually three ballot questions around the country that dealt with this issue. One in Kentucky, one in Nebraska, and one in Colorado. The Colorado ballot initiative attempted to enshrine school choice in the state constitution, and it failed to get enough votes because it involved amending the constitution. They had essentially like a higher bar that had to be reached. The voucher measures that went up for a vote in Kentucky and Nebraska went down to just crushing defeat. And it's really interesting to think about why that would be in states that are also going overwhelmingly, not just for Donald Trump, but for Republicans at really every level. And I would make the case to you that what we're seeing in those states is actually pretty similar to what happened in Massachusetts yesterday with Vote Yes on 2. And that is that whether you were in a red state or you were in a state like Massachusetts, there is a huge gulf between the kinds of policies that people in on all parts of the political spectrum would like to see for their schools and their kids and what is on offer. And here in Massachusetts, like I don't have to tell all of you, our policy elites and most of our elected officials are in absolute lockstep that the definition of a school is where a kid goes to learn to take a test, and that is how you measure whether a school is performing or not. And we've heard from communities again and again, whether we're talking about state takeovers or a ballot question like Yes on 2, that the policies that the state is offering are far narrower and far more punitive than what people on the ground are actually interested in. And that is very similar to what we saw in states like Kentucky and Nebraska. In addition to those ballot issues, there were also some glimmers of hope in a couple of other states. In North Carolina, where education was a huge issue, people voted overwhelmingly against the Republican gubernatorial candidate who had urged parents to pull their kids out of the public schools. They voted against the superintendent of instruction who had called for Obama to basically be, I think, hung on TV. It was not good. And that vote was a little closer than I would have hoped to see. But they also used public concern over the assault on public education in North Carolina and the enormous voucher program there. They were able to generate enough excitement that they cut into the Republican supermajority in the House. And finally, I would give you the example of Florida, which was absolutely swamped by Trumpism yesterday. It continued its march towards the right, except on the issue of education. And isn't that interesting? Because you would think that has been such a hallmark of what DeSantis has tried to push through. And I happened to speak with a reporter in Tampa this morning, and he said that there were 22 communities that had referenda where they're choosing to raise their own taxes in order to support their schools, and all 22 of them passed those referenda, often by enormous margins, including in parts of the state that are really red, and where groups like Moms for Liberty and the 1776 PAC have been really active. Voters in Florida also rejected a measure that would have made school board races partisan. And I take that as yet another indication that people are not so keen on seeing their schools turned into the kind of overheated political battle zones that we're seeing take over every other part of our life. And so I wanted you to know that there are some things to feel good about, but also when I look at all of those examples, I see something very similar to what happened in Massachusetts, that when you give the public a chance to weigh in and say, actually, we're not so crazy about this policy, you are going to get a result that's far different than when policymaking is left up to just education officials or lawmakers.
Yeah, one more piece of good news, and Jennifer, we're going to run out of time for all the doom and gloom if we don't get moving.
All right, all right.
We'll only get through the doom, and then people will wonder, well, what
Where's the
about the
gloom?
gloom? One more piece of what I think is good news here is that in making the case for supporting public education, which is something that we're going to have to do over the next 4 years, and that folks in red states have had to do for the past couple of years as voucher bills have been introduced. One piece of good news there is that we don't have to merely support the status quo. And here there's a nice connection to question 2. The appetite out there for a broader, bolder vision of public education is enormous. That people are not bought into the neoliberal vision of public education governance, in which the state holds schools accountable for a vanishingly narrow slice of what schools do, in which students learn how to write, paragraph responses in response to passages rather than real literature, in which the joy of school is drained out, in which educators are stripped of their autonomy and encouraged to act as the operators of a factory. This is not a vision that there is any real support for any longer, other than perhaps a kind of sclerotic ruling class among Democratic centrists and traditional Republicans. That consensus era may still be in its kind of dying days among policy elites, but it is done in terms of the public, and we heard it yesterday from Massachusetts residents in terms of their resounding support for question 2, despite the Democratic governor, for whom there is also very strong support, and her Secretary of Education coming out against question 2. And so one of the things that Jennifer and I have been encouraging people to do is make clear to everyone they talk with about education that the principles of public education are what we are seeking to preserve, but we are not seeking to preserve the status quo. And in as much as that is the case, there is real opportunity for a progressive vision of public education to make more advances in an age of downright hostility from the right. There's more potential now, actually, than during the previous quarter century of consensus governance around public education, in which George W. Bush and Barack Obama were indistinguishable when it came to education policy, despite being very different in lots of other ways.
Well, Jack, now I feel even better. And so it's time for us to switch gears
And make
and
everybody sad.
make everybody sad. So Dale mentioned that we have a podcast called Have You Heard? And so we often interview experts, teachers, academics. But Jack, I thought to switch things up that I would do a little interview with you. You are the education historian on our show. And so that means that whatever terrible thing is being proposed right now, you know whether it happened before, what the results were, and finally, how did it end? And so I'm really curious to hear from you. What what is the one thing that you're most worried about when it comes to education policy and the incoming administration?
Yeah, I think I'm worried that they'll figure out how policy actually works. That's my biggest fear. Conversely, my deepest hope is that Donald Trump continues to focus on eliminating the Department of Education. Not because I want to see the department eliminated, but because we've heard the same thing from Republican presidential candidates ever since Ronald Reagan ran promising to eliminate the department. And we have seen that this sort of narrow-minded, naive focus on the Department of Education distracts ideologically inclined leaders from doing much more policy-oriented things that can do real damage, like, for instance, changing how we enforce civil rights. That's my biggest fear right now, is that the civil rights of students will not be protected at the federal level, and that there will be coordination between the Trump White House and state level legislatures in which our trans students, our non-binary students, students of color, English language learners, undocumented students, right, when these students will be at even greater risk. And the federal government has been a backstop for civil rights for students for as long as any of us who are on this call can remember. And so that's my biggest fear. And we do know that some of that can happen via executive action. And so during the Biden administration, there were efforts to basically undo the damage done during the previous Trump administration. Nevertheless, that damage that had been done by the Trump administration to young people and their rights in schools was real, and that's what we face for the next 4 years. Executive actions can also be undone, right? But the experiences that young people have in schools cannot, and so that's what I'm worried about right now.
So you mentioned undocumented students, and that feels like an issue that we should take a little time over, because to the extent that the incoming Trump administration really has an education policy, it tends to focus on what they identify as indoctrination in the schools, right? That at his campaign rallies, he would routinely threaten to cut federal funding to schools that are engaged in any kind of gender indoctrination, and then very broadly defined, just anything political. But there isn't much that you can identify as an actual policy. But then, like, you can absolutely see how the administration's education policy and its immigration policy would overlap. I want you to put your historian's hat back on and tell us a little bit about the rights that those students currently have, and what might happen to those rights under a second Trump administration.
Yeah, right. That those students have the right to attend school, regardless of their parents' immigration status, and it will take some time to undo those rights, but it is possible via executive actions and through further efforts to pack courts with conservatives to change the status quo with regard to the rights that undocumented students have, just like we're seeing happen with regard to women's rights to control their own bodies and healthcare decisions. So one of the things that I think activists need to do is help the American public understand why it is that we educate undocumented students in our public schools. I think it's very easy to villainize marginalized groups about whom stories can be told, particularly when those groups are so marginalized that they feel unsafe to stand up and speak up for themselves. The reason why we educate young people, regardless of their paperwork in our public education system, is that they are here in the United States. And we believe, by and large, as a people, that we are better off with those young people in school, learning English, being acclimated to American norms, developing job-ready skills, and being ready for life in the United States should they be able to stay here, right? That we are better off as a society than by forcing young people underground, which is not only a recipe for social and economic disruption, but also a form of child abuse. So, you know, I think that one of the things we need to do that is even broader than that is help people understand why we fund public education with our tax dollars in the first place, right? This is something that we are going to hear from the Trump administration over and over and over again, is that the money should follow the child, and that families ought to have the right to choose where their children go to school. And there are reasons why that's not how our system works. And chief among them is the fact that public education is not a welfare program. It is not a handout to parents. It is not free private schooling. That public education is something that we have decided to do collectively as a society because we all benefit from it, right? We all benefit from knowing that young people are attending school, right? They're learning how to get along with people from different kinds of backgrounds. They're developing a very broad range of competencies, right? So despite the focus on quote unquote college and career readiness, we know that Americans have continued to advocate for a broad-based education that includes all of the untested subjects that have been marginalized over the past 30 years here in Massachusetts. That doing this for all young people, including giving them the kinds of civic preparation that will benefit them once they become not only of voting age, but fully fledged members of our society, that doing these kinds of things in school, sure, benefits those young people directly, but also benefits all of us, enables us to operate with basic assumptions about what everybody in our society knows and is able to do, the kinds of dispositions and habits of mind that they have. And that's a case that we are going to need to make. And the bright side of this is that we have taken public education for granted for 5 generations, right? So for at least the past 100 years, but probably the last 150 years here in Massachusetts, public education has been so well established and funded by taxpayers on an open enrollment basis that it's a part of the ecosystem, right? It's a part of the water in which we swim, and we haven't needed to make the case for why we have it and why we do it. And the threat to public education that is being posed by ideologues who don't believe in the idea of public education, don't believe we should be funding it with our tax dollars, don't believe that it should be democratically controlled, will require us to make an argument that I think will actually do a lot of good, both for young people and for educators and for society.
So we're probably going to hear pretty quickly um, uh, uh, some kind of a pledge to abolish the Department of Education. But we're probably, before that happens, we're going to find out who the individual is who will be running that department before it is or isn't
Dismantled.
abolished. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. We're all old enough on this call to remember Betsy DeVos's tenure. What is there anybody who you're keeping an eye out for? And what kind of, when you talk about habits of mind and disposition, what kind of person would really worry you?
Yeah, right. I'd be more worried about Chris Rufo than Ryan Walters. So, for those unfamiliar, Ryan Walters is the state chief in Oklahoma. And Walters has engaged in all of the typical kinds of culture warring that we are now used to seeing from folks on the far right in education. So he has fully embraced, for instance, PragerU. So he's got the Oklahoma Department of Education Twitter handle tweeting out, just a reminder that all students in Oklahoma now have access to PragerU, which of course is an ideological project of right-winger Dennis Prager and is as much a university as Trump University was. Walters's kind of radical, ideological, right-wing policy is much more performative in nature. Chris Rufo's is also performative. So those who aren't familiar with Rufo, he's a Manhattan Institute fellow. This is the right-wing think tank who was the mastermind behind using the phrase critical race theory to talk about any teaching of race in our schools, and was quite upfront about his disingenuous adoption of that phrase, just like he has been quite upfront about talking about the usefulness of culture war in advancing an unpopular and ideological policy idea, in this case, private school vouchers. So whereas Walters has been largely, flame without heat, Rufo has been much more strategic in thinking about the ways that culture war can actually be used to advance private school vouchers, and came out to directly say that the surest path towards universal school choice is universal public school distrust. Rufo has been involved in Florida with the attacks on the higher education system there, including New College, which previously had been a kind of progressive liberal arts college, publicly funded by the people of Florida. And I would be worried that somebody like Chris Rufo would have enough wherewithal to get connected with policy insiders who know about how change is made inside federal agencies. And this is one of the reasons why I don't see the Department of Education going anywhere. I do believe that we will see much more lax enforcement of civil rights, though there are career bureaucrats who will continue trying to do their jobs. And Congress still does make the law, though there are going to be changes in our Congress. But I think the Department of Education will persist because the Trump administration will see it as politically expedient to try to enact some of the promises that have been made on the campaign trail. And without a Department of Education, it'll be interesting to watch them try to do that.
So I think you've given us a good sense of some of the things that we should be keeping an eye out for, and some things that we should probably be worried about. I've got one more to ask you about. Most of the people on this call are familiar with Project 2025, or as you and I often refer to it, Project 1825. One of the interesting things to observe during the last few months is that while it can be easy to get the sense that everyone on the right is in lockstep when it comes to their vision and how to carry it out, there's actually a lot of disagreement. It wasn't that, it was just a few weeks ago that the Trump folks were pledging that no person who was associated with Project 2025 would have a position in the administration. We'll see whether that actually happens. But I wondered if there's, when it comes to the education vision of Project 2025, is there anything that you think we should be particularly concerned with?
Yeah, I think we should be keeping our eyes on uh, the channeling of public dollars toward religious education. This has been a project of the right for a very long time. And there is a convergence that we should be paying attention to. Interest convergence between market ideologues and Christian nationalists. So Christian nationalists have long been making the case that they are discriminated against because public dollars flow to secular schools in the case of our public schools, but not towards the religious schools that they prefer to send their children to. And increasingly, we have seen not just state level courts, but the Supreme Court sympathetic to that kind of reasoning. And simultaneously, we have seen the rise of market ideologues in education policy. And this is where private school vouchers as an idea are really being advanced from, right? So the idea for private school vouchers comes to us originally from Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winning University of Chicago free market economist who first proposed private school vouchers 3/4 of a century ago. Now, if you're a free market zealot, you may have no interest at all in advancing religious education. You may be neutral about it, agnostic about it. Sure, that could be one choice among many. But of course, if you're seeking to move students out of the public education system, the vast majority of choices that they will have in the private sector are religious schools. And so there is a kind of interest convergence here between market ideologues and Christian nationalists, in that market ideologues need Christian schools to be acceptable as places that families could take taxpayer dollars and spend on tuition in order to be able to offer what they frame as universal school choice. And Christian nationalists need the market ideologues in order to siphon off dollars from our public schools and send them to religious schools. As it happens, Americans aren't particularly interested in funding religious education with their tax dollars. There's a reason why we moved religion out of our schools. Once upon a time, our schools actually were quite religious in nature, right? Protestant Christianity was at the heart of our very earliest public schools. And gradually, the public, and we're talking many publics here because this is mostly a locally governed system from the 19th century all the way up into the mid 20th century, right? The public in these many publics decided to move religion further and further from the center of what happens in schools and eventually out of public schooling entirely. And right now, there is an effort, again, because of this interest convergence between market ideologues and Christian nationalists, to put religion back at the heart of what we do. And this is scary, not just because it threatens to defund public schools, but because it threatens to balkanize us further. The reason we moved religion out of schools in the first place is that it was tearing communities apart. Right? So public education is designed to do many things, but one of the core things it's designed to do is bring us together and make us a public. And having religious conflict in the schools, we have learned through experience, is a certain way to further fragment our society and actually accomplish one of the aims that the far right has right now, which is for all of us to stop thinking of each other as co-members of democratic communities, but rather to think of ourselves only as individuals who should be able to exercise choice in a free market, not just with regard to our schools, but with regard to anything that we want to do in American life.
Well, Jack, that was filled with more doom and gloom than I think any of us really needed. So, as you heard earlier, Jack and I are the authors of two books, and the most recent is this one. It's called The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual. And I'm going to turn it so you can see just how slender it is. It practically reads itself. And it will prepare you for all of the kinds of policy fights that we are about to live through once the new administration takes office. Whether it's religious freedom, as Jack was just describing, the whole idea that we should be funding students, not systems, parents' rights, as well as an overview of why our schools are at the center of so many conflicts right now. We devote the last part of the book to the citizens, really like the citizens guide. What do we do about all of this, right? Because it's not enough to just sit at home clicking on one terrible story after another, right? And we have to figure out how to do something about this. And so we have a chapter called Democracy is Not a Spectator Sport. And we take a little trip up to New Hampshire and we learn an important lesson there that once locals stop getting involved in the democratic oversight of their schools, there are plenty of other folks who are more than ready to step in and take the schools in often a dramatically different, sometimes very controversial direction. So we lay out a very inspiring story about a community in New Hampshire where the libertarian movement known as the Free State Project uh, enacted an enormous budget cut to a local school and then basically seeded a revolt as a result. And the folks who were organizing, and they were organizing in a great, really old-fashioned New England way, they would stand out in front of the transfer station on the weekends, gathering signatures. They found a loophole in state law that if they gathered together enough registered voters, they could essentially undo the budget cut to their local school. This is a community where it's so small, as a lot of places in New Hampshire are. They have a K-5 school, but everybody else goes to one of the neighboring districts. And because the budget cut was so severe, it meant that the cost of paying for tuition at a neighboring district was now going to be borne largely by the parents themselves. This is one of those sort of fine print deals that you will often, if you listen in on folks who are not committed to the idea of taxpayer funded education, they'll slip in there that actually the goal is to start to get parents. If you're really going to be a consumer, you should pay for it yourself, just the way we do with higher ed. Now, I would imagine that any of you on this call who've put kids through college or at your young age are still paying off your college loans, like none of you would look at the way we fund higher ed, private or public, and think, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Let's also do that with K-12. And that's exactly what folks in this community in New Hampshire thought. And so they succeeded in bringing together the single largest gathering in the history of this town, and they took another vote. And by a margin of something like 387 to 2, they reversed the budget cut. But what was so inspiring to me, I was lucky enough to get to be there, was that you really saw people from all walks of life and all, like every political view, people who are arguing intently these days about which candidate to support. When it came to seeing the kind of an orchestrated effort to undermine their public schools, they were furious. And so we really learned a lot from that story, because it isn't enough just to educate ourselves and and our loved ones about the threats that are coming down the pike. And it isn't enough for us just to be saying no to the policy ideas that we don't like. And I think that's what was really also inspiring about the Yes on 2 campaign, is that you all successfully made the case that school is about more than just taking a test. And so, boy, are we going to need all of our collective ability to wake our neighbors up and remind them that it is absolutely the case that democracy is not a spectator sport, and that you cannot have democracy without having public schools.
Jennifer, I'm wondering how much time we should reserve for questions, because I know that folks may actually have directions that they'd like to take this conversation. But one last thing that I think we should talk about before we open things up, and have no fear, folks, if you have no questions. You're dealing with a long-winded professor who can talk for hours on end. But I'm wondering what kinds of local organizing would be most useful here in Massachusetts. You talk to organizers all over the country, and many of them actually begin their work in response to immediate threats. And I'm wondering what you think the best way to begin organizing in support of public education here in Massachusetts is or are for our Massachusetts-based audience.
I see what you did there. You just turned it around on me and asked a question. Well, I really feel like that is that you all you started doing that, not just with Yes on Two, but this is now the third successive ballot question where the MTA and its membership has been more in line with the public than our policy elites, state education officials, and lawmakers. And I'm thinking first about Yes on the question 2 back in 2016. And boy, was I having some flashbacks to that last night, when we all went to bed feeling like we had won this huge victory with question 2 in charter schools, despite being outmanned and attracting the support of seemingly every billionaire in the country. Um, so so there was that one, and then of course there was the millionaires tax, because you all were successfully able to make the case that the public really cares about investing in public schools. And when you turned out to be right about the amount of money that would be brought in, and then here you were again with Yes on Two, yet again, tapping into public sentiment in a way that I think people who shape policy in Massachusetts are, you're reminding them that they don't actually speak for the public. And I was fully aware of this when I waited in line at the grocery store to sign the petition. And I saw that when, like when people would get to the question 2 petition and they would hear a brief description about, what it was about, that they couldn't sign fast enough, right? That they are so over standardized testing. And so I think the next phase is, because in almost all of our communities, the teachers, usually the MTA, sometimes AFT Massachusetts, are the single largest organized force. And that means that if they are able to lay out a vision that really speaks to people in the community, especially right now, speaking to people across party lines, like in Gloucester, where I am, that is the next phase. That's the kind of organizing that we need to see happen. I see examples of it happening around the country. I would just point to one, and then I think we should take as many questions as you all have. There have now been several states, all of whom have Republican leadership. The states have threatened to stop accepting federal funding for their schools because there are quote unquote too many strings attached. And what they mean by that is precisely what Jack was talking about. They don't want the civil rights enforcement requirements that come along with taking federal money. And so that's why you would hear states making noises about not offering universal school lunch. But several states said, you know what, we're going to stop accepting federal funding. And then what would happen is their constituents would realize that they were talking about losing billions of dollars and that it meant that their kids' school wasn't like, not only was there no plan to fully fund it, but they were actually talking about cutting funds. And so in states like Tennessee, you saw this issue just become explosive in all different parts of the state, including very conservative rural parts. And I think a big, a big responsibility on all of us is going to be to take those policy ideas that are coming down from the federal level and that we know the public doesn't support and translate it to them in language that they can understand. Because as we all know, when it comes to education policy, it can quickly become a very weedy topic and a very sleepy topic.
I'm going to just say one more thing before we open it up to questions, and that's that I think all of us on this call should be thinking about who we would like the next president of the United States, who would be taking office in 2029 to be, and what that person's position on public education should be. We should also be thinking about the next governor of Massachusetts. And we should be thinking about our representatives in Congress, as well as in the state legislature. We're doing pretty well in terms of the state legislature and their support for public education, though not universally so. But one of the things that Jennifer and I have been writing about recently is the Democratic Party's complete failure, at least in national races, to really have a compelling message around public education. Every single person on this call could craft a more compelling and energizing vision of public education than we have heard come out of the Democratic Party for the past several decades. And so how can we use our knowledge and our organizing skills to begin forcing education onto the agenda in a positive way, in terms of advocating for the kinds of supports that we know that young people need, the kinds of freedoms to teach that educators deserve, and the kinds of full programming that communities demand.